Bien, pues muy buenas tardes, muy buenas noches. Esperamos que se encuentren muy bien.
Good afternoon. We hope you are all doing fine. On behalf of the German Agency for International Cooperation, the Organization for Economic Development Organization, and the Institute on Land Policy, we would like to welcome you to this session. My name is Luis Felipe Quintanilla, a program analyst with the Lincoln Institute. It is a pleasure to greet you and to be a part of this webinar that is part of the initiative named 100 Years of Contributing to Value. And the idea in Colombia, and the idea is to recover all these topics for land value capture, as well as its main challenges and possible applications. This is the sixth event of the series, and we would have a presentation of a global compound for land value capture of OECD and the Lincoln Institute with the cooperation of the German Agency for International Cooperation, followed by a panel from experts from Mexico, Brazil, Ecuador, Chile, and Colombia that will share a perspective of their experiences in their countries along with different financing strategies based on land value. It is a pleasure to welcome our dear colleague Barbara Scholz, collaborator of the German Agency for International Cooperation, currently advisory for the German Ministry of Cooperation on these topics. So she can give us a welcoming words. Welcome. Thank you, Luis. I really appreciate being able to be here with you, and I would also like to welcome all the audience, all our friends that are participating in this event, and of course, our colleagues from Lincoln, OECD, the urban program on public governance and land development, for being present and making this event a reality, and of course our people from World Bank, ECLAT, and all those who have cooperated in the preparation of this cycle of events for the celebration of 100 years of the legal life of this organization in Colombia. I am really happy to be here, and I hope that this is going to be a very interesting event for all of you. And we would like this opportunity to expand our vision, our view, and to take a look beyond our reality and also the differences, and to get to know other experiences along with the same instrument, but others as well, for land value capture in other countries in the region. And with this, we would like to generate reflections and also land value capture to promote sustainable urban development and the fight against the global warming in the region. And we are convinced that all those tools are going to expand our space for action with this interface for land management. And beyond that, all of this has a great potential to promote participative and transparent governance and to contribute to the redistribution of benefits in order to have more equality and being climate sensitive. And now with these words, I would like to welcome the director of the urban program for governance on OECD. That is going to be our first presentation. Luis already indicated how we would handle this agenda. We're going to start with this presentation of a global compendium of land value capture between OECD and Lincoln, and then we'll get to know about specific cases that we have proposed for today. So go ahead, please. Good afternoon. I'll make my presentation in English.
So I hope, can you see it all?
Sí.
Okay, great, excellent. So I'm very, very pleased to have the opportunity to be with you tonight to talk about land value capture. What I will do is I will present the Global Compendium on Land Value Capture, which is a joint project by the OECD and the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy, and with great contributions from GSZ, which has, among other things, provided data for 12 of their partner countries. I will first briefly motivate why land value capture is relevant today. Then I'll talk about the aim of our compendium and share some preliminary overview findings. Afterwards, I will give you an idea about the content of the compendium for each country. And last but not least, show how policymakers and researchers can use it. So why should countries be interested in land value capture? Land value capture is, of course, a very important potential tool for financing infrastructure, which obviously is especially important in the context of urbanization and growing cities. But it's also, we're in the middle of COP26. So land value capture can be a very potent tool to finance climate action. Has a lot of potential. And we're having the situation where public actions create value, and this value can also be captured or can be used for climate action. I will take the example of developer obligations, which are a special land value capture instrument to show how they could be used for climate action. The basic principle of developer obligations is that developers are subject to obligations to obtain approval for new development or densification. The value creation aspect is the following. If a project is approved and developers are allowed to increase the height of a building or to construct a new building, the value of the land increases. But the new development or the densification will have an impact on existing infrastructure. It means that more people will come to an area, and typically that means the need for new or more public infrastructure. And developer obligations can be the value recovery aspect. Developers must pay in cash, provide land, or build public infrastructure in order to compensate the impact of the development on existing infrastructure. So how can countries use developer obligations, for climate action? For example, developer obligations could require developers to finance or provide land or to build energy efficient buildings and housing, or they could build green spaces, parks, hanging gardens, and green roofs, which then can help to sequester greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, they can help to build infrastructure for the energy transition, such as solar panels on the roofs of buildings and charging stations for electric cars. They can help to build public transport for denser urban areas, for example, bigger stations, or they can help to build flood risk reduction infrastructure and improve drainage systems to evacuate stormwater. So that's just one example of a land value capture tool that can be used for climate action. But there are, of course, others, for example, land readjustment, infrastructure levies, transfer of development rights, and others as well. So let me now turn and give you a brief introduction to the compendium itself. So what is the aim of the compendium? The main aim is basically to give a systematic overview of the use of land value capture globally. It's supposed to provide systematic information about the land value capture instruments that countries use and about national and subnational frameworks that guide local governments towards greater use of these instruments. It will contain information that is comparable, and that's really important, that is comparable across countries and local governments. The compendium covers 61 countries, 37 OECD countries and 24 selected non-OECD countries in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. For the data collection, we have surveyed academic experts on land value capture from each country that we are having in the compendium. And they have been answering a very thorough, large-scale questionnaire. We're also having an advisory group of 20 international experts that have helped us develop the compendium and that will also review our results. We're planning to publish the compendium in early 22, but let me show you some preliminary findings now already. So on this slide, we just show the number of countries using each land value capture instrument. So this is preliminary findings, so the exact numbers may still change, but I think it's giving you an impression basically of what we're doing and also what the gist of the findings will be. So what you can see is that more countries seem to be using strategic land management and development obligations. The reason for that is probably that these are more routine practices that countries are doing anyway in regular planning processes, and therefore they're easy in a way to implement compared to instruments like changes for development rights or the infrastructure levy that often need more specific and more complex legislation. The point being here that the legal aspect of instruments is very important. Compared to other instruments, the infrastructure levy often also requires complex formulas to identify landowners who benefit from public improvements. So it's two things. First, you need to identify the owners, and then you also need to calculate the improvement that has been basically done. And that requires obviously a lot of administrative capacity. Here you can see a map that shows the number of instruments that are used by a given country. You can see that's the red dots. Basically, there are 3 countries that don't seem to use any land value capture instruments. 27 countries seem to use 2 or 3 instruments, and 30 countries seem to use 4 or 5 instruments. On the surface, that looks pretty good because, most countries use some land value capture and many countries use quite a lot of different tools. The problem is that this doesn't mean that they use these tools frequently or in a systematic way. In the compendium, we will help you to understand why some countries use more instruments than others and why some instruments are used more than other instruments. So what will the content of the compendium be for each country? First, we look at the enabling framework for land value capture. So we're looking at the constitutional framework, we're looking at key laws for land value capture instruments and the planning system. Then we also look at all the land value capture instruments in a given country. What are the conditions to use the instruments? Who implements the instruments and receives the revenues? Whether the instruments capture a lot of value and are used frequently, and the technical aspects of the instruments. So, for example, technical aspects meaning how the various land value capture charges are estimated and how landowners or developers are charged. Last but not least, we look at what makes instruments successful or which are the obstacles for their use. So, for example, the adequacy of legislation, the political will to use the instruments, the acceptance or resistance by landowners and developers, and the administrative capacity of local governments. And all this will be done with a comparative approach. So why is this new comparative approach of a compendium so important, and these findings which are going with it? At the moment, there are many successful examples of land value capture around the world, but the instruments and the methods that are used differ greatly from country to country and sometimes even within countries. However, there's very few governments who use land value capture on a large scale. And there's very little systematic information available on all this. For example, there's no international database on land value capture that policymakers and researchers can use. Most of the evidence that is known today comes from case studies. And there's little information about the degree to which countries use land value capture instruments in a more systematic way. There are some governments who manage to raise large sums through land value capture, but many others obtain only very limited revenues. In a way, we know about individual cases of success, but we don't know what can be done to make land value capture systematically successful. For these reasons, it's difficult to provide guidance to national and local governments. So how can policymakers and researchers use the compendium? In this context also, it's important to understand what have we learned so far. We have realized that it's difficult to draw a clear line between different land value capture instruments as these often overlap. Moreover, in practice, countries often do similar things, but they call them differently. And that obviously means that it's very difficult for countries to talk to each other, because if they use the same term, but they mean very different things, then obviously the conversation is not going to be very successful. I just want to give you an example. For example, in Israel and Poland, the betterment levy applies when land plots are granted development rights and their value increases. However, in other countries like the UK, the betterment levy refers to infrastructure improvements and not to development rights, like in Poland and Israel. So the same name refers to very different instruments in some countries. And then obviously you cannot really compare things across countries. And even kind of like in a way, you cannot even talk about these things in the different countries. So one of the first things we have been doing with the Compendium, we have developed a standard to talk about land value capture globally. And we have developed what we call the OC Lincoln Institute terminology of land value capture instruments, and that applies globally. And that's really important, because this is the basic fundament that will allow governments and experts to talk to each other, to compare international experiences in a way where they really have a meaningful dialogue and understand each other. This terminology is based on the literature, of course, and takes into account the data that we collected from the 61 countries. So with this new terminology, policymakers and researchers will be able to compare their approaches. They'll be able to learn from each other, and especially on ways to gain support for the use of land value capture. And obviously, they'll be able to understand and apply best practices in different contexts. For example, a country will be able to analyze the approaches and successes of other countries with a similar legal framework, or which had similar challenges in the past. So basically, the Compendium will be a major step forward in the attempt of making land value capture not only a tool that is used here and there by governments, sometimes also very successful, but the tool which will really be a systematic and kind of like a systematic part of the tool case of governments for raising revenue for important public investments. That's what I wanted to tell you. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward for the dialogue and the presentations that are going to follow.
Perfecto, muchas gracias, Rüdiger.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your presentation. Very interesting to get to know the results. We are really proud to have been a part or to have contributed to this important research for those of us who have been working for years on land value capture. I think that this is a great step to take this study, which, by the way, is the first systematic compendium of this importance and this methodologically strictness. And you have mentioned some important points about what the compendium consists of, taking into consideration the legal and political framework, conditions for implementation, and also obstacles and incentives for its implementation. And we have seen how important this study is going to be, because this compendium is going to be the basis for mutual learning and political debate for the different alternatives that we have. And And there is also great interest on behalf of other parts of the world, specifically on the Latin American experience. We know about our colleagues from India and Bangladesh that have been working with us on this compendium, and I think that this is going to be a very interesting base. So again, thank you, Rüdiger. And now we'll continue with the second part of the event. And now we'll go to the presentation of specific cases. We have selected 4 cases that are also part of this compendium and that refer to countries in Latin America. So maybe some of you already have some questions or comments regarding Rüdiger's presentation. So I would kindly ask you to write down those questions on the chat, and Luis will help us handle them. And then we will include it on the debate that we will have after the presentations. So please do not forget to write down your questions and comments on the chat, and then we'll answer all of them during the panel after the presentation of cases. Each case is going to take 10 minutes, and we will begin with Mexico, and I would like to invite Ignacio Cols to start with his first case, the case of Mexico. Ignacio is an urban geographist and researcher from the Faculty of Architecture of Mexico's National University with over 30 years experience as a professor related to urban structure, soil economy, and tools for urban development, a professor of Lincoln Institute, where he teaches remotely for Latin America and the Caribbean on topics like planning for land management and transfer of right for development and land value. So please, the floor is yours. Thank you. You are going to upload my presentation, right? Or do I have to do it? Please go ahead if you can.
Muchas gracias a la OCDE.
I would like to thank OCDE, the German Agency for International Cooperation. Okay, now it's better, but it's not centered.
Vuelvo a compartir.
Sí, por favor. Está un poco cortado en el lado derecho.
Sí lo veo, que está cortado en el lado derecho.
We cannot read it completely. I teach classes 3 to 4 times a week, and this never happens.
Ignacio, si quieres intentamos, déjame
Ignacio, maybe let me do my screen sharing to see if I can help with that.
Perfecto. Bueno, agradezco mucho a la
So again, I would like to thank OCDE, the German Agency for International Cooperation, and the Lincoln Institute for the invitation to participate on this compendium and this presentation. The experience in Mexico has been interesting because since 1929, we have been trying to integrate the social function of property, but since then there has been a great opposition from groups of interest. The first attempt was through the Civil Code of the Federation, and then throughout the years, different instruments were created on 7 states of the Republic, and there were some land value laws that were not applied, and some of them have been abolished. So the creation of improvements that we have in the country since 1971, 50 years now, but in most places, it is not even applied. And it might be used by some municipalities or institutions that might account for not more than 1% of the municipal income. There is a good experience in the transfer of development rights applied to the restoration of the historic center in Mexico City that resulted, in spite of being a transfer, a group, a benefit because they were able to restore the center. So in the case of Mexicali, they applied the base tax. And we would like to follow that because it's a unique experience. And in Mexico, we must say that they charge for the appraisal of real estate, but as part of the income tax. So it is not a local tax. It is calculated. This land value capture is like something that you add to people's income or companies' income. Next, please.
¿Cuáles han sido los
Which
obstáculos?
have been then the obstacles? We would have obstacles of 3 main groups: resistance, some ideological resistance. Some years ago, we wanted to incorporate the topic of the land value to the Constitution of Mexico City. There was a huge resistance, and it was because of ideological reasons. There is also resistance due to interest, both from officials that share part of the corruption derived from the changes in land use with the increases in intensity, that they do not see this with good eyes. And there is also a problem of political interest. There is fear to affect the political capital of some people or groups that are interested in political careers. There are limits in juridical or legal structure because although the federal legislation recognizes this, it recognizes the tax, the appraisal, the state legislations do not confirm this, do not recognize this. So the municipalities, which are the ones that have this power, are not able to do so. In many cases, there is interest, but they do not have the legal mechanism to do so. And finally, we have the administrative institutional limitations for a lot of the municipalities. They see this as a big challenge, even proposing very simple systems. Next slide, please. The impact is minimum, both in economic terms as well as in urban terms. We have exceptions, which was the case of the transfer of building rights in the historical center of Mexico City, especially between 1989 and 1990. And there are 2 very interesting cases of land management and appraisal or land value management. One in the first case, which is the Tres Rios urban project in the city of Culiacan, where the flooding areas for the rivers was released for urban development. And this generated a lot of resources that were used to urbanize and to develop all the area in the map. Another simpler case is when the Monterrey Melting Park stopped operating, and it became a public space project through rents and leasing and some participation or strategic associations that generated a very, very valuable space for the city of Monterrey. Next slide. Which are then the conditions that we need to take into account to implement? I think that we have to continue with the reflection in order to generate a culture for land value management. I have to mention that at this moment, There is a lot of interest by the federal government, by some state governments, because the mechanisms or funding mechanisms have been reduced from the federation to the municipality. So with this crisis, there is good momentum to be able to promote these types of instruments. We would require legal reforms, both at the federal level as well as at the state level, especially the state level. Federal, most of them are implicit. It is very important to recognize the differences among us. We have municipalities of over 1 million inhabitants. We have some other municipalities with 300 inhabitants, completely rural. But in almost all of them, there are conditions to develop some type of instrument. And I think that what would be important at this moment is to prepare a general plan to be able to implement this throughout the country. Finally, the last line, I've been requested to say, okay, what can we do in terms of cooperation? And I think that evaluating some of these experiences that I mentioned before could be important. The contribution of improvements in a few places where this have been applied, but they have been applied more constantly, because in some cases it is applied during one government administration and then it stopped application afterwards. And then analyze rejection cases. There are some very clear cases of rejection to the sale proposal for these building rights or collection of some type in terms of appraisal. And perhaps also to make a stakeholder analysis, especially these stakeholders, which are their discourses, which are their arguments, which are their concerns, because in many cases there are serious problems regarding information. People may interpret different things. So this will be all on my part. I really thank you very much for your attention.
Muchas gracias, Ignacio.
Thank you very much, Ignacio.
Has tocado algunos temas muy
You
importantes
have
en tu
touched some
presentación
very
que
important
ya
topics in your
vemos en el
presentation
chat que han
that we
inspirado
see
algunas
in the chat that they have
preguntas.
inspired some
Mencionaste
questions. You mentioned
el tema de la
the topic
de la diversidad de las ciudades,
of the diversity of the
de
cities,
los sitios donde se aplican los instrumentos.
the diversity of the
Has
places
hecho
where the instruments are
las
applied. You have
condiciones
also mentioned
específicas de un
the
estado
specific conditions of a
con
federal state
diferentes niveles de
with
gobierno,
different
mandatos
levels
y
of government,
competencias.
mandates and
También
competences.
has mencionado
And you
algunas
have
de las
also
resistencias
mentioned
que los
some of
trabajadores
the
de esta
resistance that might be found
los intentos
for
de
this
implementación de
debate in
México.
the attempts of implementation in
Pasaríamos
Mexico.
ahora a la presentación de
We
Cristina
would now
Gómez
go to the
Jurado,
presentation
al
by
caso
Cristina Gómez
de
Jurado,
Ecuador.
the case of Ecuador.
Cristina
Cristina
arquitecta de la Universidad
is an
de San
architect
Francisco,
from
tiene
the
una maestría en
University of San
gestión urbana
Francisco in
para el
Quito. She has a
desarrollo,
master's in urban
una
management for
especialización en
development
desarrollo del
with a
suelo
specialization in land
en la
development from the
Universidad
Institute of
de la
Housing and
Erasmus de
Studies
Rotterdam de los Países
from the
Bajos.
University of
Ha sido
Rotterdam,
consultora para el
Netherlands.
gobierno
She's
nacional y
been a
local
consultant for the
Ecuador,
national and local government in Ecuador and international cooperation and
sostenibilidad de derecho a la
expertise
ciudad y cambio
with a
climático.
focus in the
Ella
sustainability of
también
city and
participó
climate change.
como experta
She
en
also
la
participated as
creación
an
del Compendio Global
expert
sobre Captura de
in
Carbono,
gathering the global companion
llevado a
for
cabo por
land value
OECD y
capture,
Lincoln
implemented
para el
by
caso de
OECD and
Ecuador.
Lincoln for the case of Ecuador.
Cristina,
So
por
Christina,
favor, preséntanos
please
el caso del
go
Ecuador.
ahead and present to us the case of
Buenas tardes
Ecuador.
con todos.
Well, good
Primero que nada,
afternoon,
muchas
everyone.
gracias por
First
el
of all, I
espacio
want to
para
thank you for this space
y la oportunidad de haber participado en el
and the
compendio
opportunity of
Untitled
participating in the
Chapter de
compendium
Ecuador.
about the land capture for
Yo
Ecuador.
quisiera contarles
I would like
principalmente
to
de
tell
dos
you mainly about
un poco distintos,
two
pero
instruments, a little bit
relativamente
different, but that can be
paradigmáticos
considered
en su aplicación
paradigmatic
aquí en el país.
in their
Diferente a
application here in
México,
the country.
Ecuador es un
Different
país
from Mexico,
unitario.
Ecuador is a unitary country.
Nuestra experiencia en contribución
Our
especial
experience in
de realizo
construction
de la contribución por
special
contribución
contribution for
de
improvement
algunos
or
países
betterment
que hablamos aquí ya
contributions or
de
betterment
implementación.
levy that Ruben was talking about at the beginning. It is
Segunda fuente, el segundo instrumento
the
tributario
second source, the
internacional
second
para
most important
financiamiento
instrument
para
for
financiamiento
local
de los
funding,
municipios.
for the funding of the
Existe la
municipalities.
normativa nacional desde
We
igual
have
que
the
en México
national
desde
regulations, just as in
1971.
Mexico, since
Es una normativa
1971.
nacional
It is a national regulation for municipal collection, and one of the strengths that have made it one of the most efficient and widely used instruments is the fact that it's very simple to calculate. The special contribution or betterment contributions uses the real value of public investment divided by the beneficiary properties lying at the local level. Each municipality defines what are these benefited properties in different ways, how it is going to be collected, during how long, and so on. But it is an instrument that is very simple in that sense. The collection for 2019 income has been 103 billion, approximately 0.095 of the GDP. It is not, I mean, it's not big recoveries, but that is the instrument that is very important for municipal financing. We have national averages of 6.1 million per inhabitant in Quito and Guayaquil, the big cities of the country. They have the biggest national average, getting close to $8 per inhabitant. It is important to mention the case of Cuenca as a paradigmatic case, where between 2010, 2001 and 2010, they collected approximately $200 per inhabitant, where there was a great use of the tool through the improvement of the neighborhoods, where they organized the whole process, where the neighborhoods would get to an agreement. They would make a request to the municipality for the improvement of the settlement. This experience that still continues in a way in Cuenca, but perhaps not so strongly. But there was a 90% of recovery of the cost of the work, and there were some percentages of expired or due portfolio that were very low. So this is a paradigmatic case of how things can really work, or how the instrument can really work. One of the reasons why this instrument is so widely used is also because starting also in 2010, the state bank established a subsidized credit line with given access to more than 80 municipalities. We have 221 municipalities, but really more than half of them have less than 20,000 inhabitants, so there's very small. But having 80 municipalities out of 221 participating in a scheme of this type is very important. One of the reasons for the success of the subsidized credit line is that it contains the technical assistance component. So as I was telling you, the instrument is very commonly used, but still, I will have to say it's still underused. There is a little study that is a little modeling from 2012 that probably didn't capture so much so far, and it provides that close to 11.4% of the investment expenditure has been recovered through betterment contributions. So this means that there is still a broad margin where we can recover investments. As I was telling you, this is a simple instrument. It does not require complex calculations. It is based, or you charge on the real value or actual value of the investment. So there's a land value or appraisal, or it's recovered in this way without making a complex calculation, which is how much goes to a public investment and then value each property and so on. So on the one hand, it does not allow for previous funding, but it allows for a later recovery of the works and a reinvestment in it. So this is the case of the betterment contributions of the national. Now, I want to tell you about the sale of development rights. This is an instrument that is used only in Quito so far since the year 2002 to 2012, when the regulation was established to allow for the purchase of two additional stories over the current regulation, different from the case of Brazil, where they established a basic building quite uniform in Sao Paulo, I think. And in Quito, the regulation is quite uneven throughout the territory, but it would provide that you could buy two additional floors. At the beginning, There were 4 cases of applications, this purchase of 2 additional floors in some special zones in urban architecture projects was large architectural projects at a large scale, then projects incorporating environmental and respectful technologies. The objective of the instrument was to promote the densification of consolidated areas that have discouraged the expansive growth of the urban groups, especially to the valleys, which is the area of the greatest pressure from the urban right here. So this tool from 2014, it started in 2014, but after 2014, 2015, it evolved little by little. The single or to the unique application case and the incorporation of these environmental criteria in the construction. And this is called eco-efficiency. And it consisted in a complex mechanism of ducts that allow not to buy 2 floors, but even to double the possibility of building capacity. So the formula for all the cases is 2012 would calculate the incidence of the land value in the building capacity that was enforced. So the more building capacity would start as the owner of the land with greater building capacity, the less expensive it was to acquire more capacity. So that is in general terms. Now, right here, we have a little bit of information about the income generated by the instrument from 2012 to 2020. So if we see, if we compare this with the budget from Quito, for example, for 2020, which is 1 billion, it generates very important income. I would say we're talking about 3 million, 4 million in the best of the years, 6 million, for example. So this is minor income, I would say. But what I do want to mention is that this evolution of the instrument, there was a change of administration in 2014. This started in the context of municipal administration that was more progressive to ones that was more pro-market. And what the instrument shows is that there was an absence of land policy. For example, when it is allowed to double, not just to increase 2 floors, but sometimes to double, like from 16 floors to 32. But it has to contemplate the size of the plots. There was a relation to the metro station, to the DOT line, as a concession for urban development oriented towards transportation. But we see that in practice, in this little map, as you can see, the majority of the cases are concentrated in just one area. That is already an area that does not need a lot of densification, leaving other areas with a lot of potential for densification were almost without cases. And especially this was expanded to the areas that were the objective, because the idea was not to urbanize, not to promote the urbanization of the valleys. However, we see that there is 5% of the cases between 2012 and 2018 that are applied in the valleys, and also that there was that the payments, it was possible to do in-kind payments, and they were normally done in the same place of the works of the projects, and that did not generate a lot of redistribution or no redistribution at all. So right here we see that it is important to manage a little bit the objectives of the instruments themselves. So it is kind of interesting to see what would be the dangers that we can have from a tool of this type without orientation of appropriate land policies. Now, the net value capture in store, in general terms, we talked about the fact that we want to see in terms of the public policy. It seems that the most important progress has taken place in the context of more progressist governments. We had the approval in 2016 of a land use law that was a long process. It took 5 years to be approved. However, we see that Quito already had some of these instruments even before the legislation, and the land use law uses or is inspired in several of the experiences for both planning as well as land use. instruments in Quito. So in Ecuador, we have had an effort of several years to consolidate a planning process in the country. Even the Constitution from 2018 already provides the mandatory aspect of planning at all levels of the government. Um, in our case, we are not lacking any legislation. The legislation is still there. Yes, it's 5 years. Still, the big challenge is to be able to implement all this battery of instruments, uh, principles such as the social function of property, the equitable distribution of burdens and benefits, the right for construction of the property. So we do have the legal regulations, and we are still in this process. It is a very new process of implementation. With regards to the impact, as I was mentioning, the financial impact is relatively low, but it's important. I mean, it still allows for the reinvestment. It still allows for investment in infrastructure. So when we talk about the discussion in land value at the end of our progresses, government in Ecuador, 2014-2015, the government was also weakened because of this land value discussion that luckily was not related to this law for soil or for land use, but it was affected in terms of the transfer of properties and also heritage, or uh, that was a very important factor that weakened the government. It's important to mention that in Quito, the building capacity still opened the door to skip the norm. It was something unthinkable before. And I think that this is still a trial and error phase that should help us reorient certain things. Now we have a new plan for land use and occupation that tries to fine tune all these prices in a way that were generated with the sale of uh, building capacities. So one of the lessons learned is that the tools to the plan, it's necessary to coordinate it, it's necessary to be clear about the different objectives, the urbanization objectives, the redistribution objectives, the big objectives of equity and territorial justice. It is interesting to see how in this case, the property industry put things together. They had a very good understanding of the capacities of the tool, and actually they used this knowledge to improve the negotiations. The more complex tools are only possible in a few cities with a more dynamic market, and I think that especially they will require for the cities like Cuenca, Guayaquil, Quito, which are the large ones and have more experience. I think that they will need a process of incentives and technical assistance from the national government. And it is important, as Ignacio was also saying, in the case of Mexico, to position in the public discourse, at least in the discourse of the people related or the associations related to urban development, when we see which is really the importance of land value capture precisely to avoid these vices that we saw in these concession rights, and keeping monitoring systems and make processes transparent. So that is all that I wanted to share with you today. Thank you very much, Cristina. There were several very important aspects about the presentation about the Ecuadorian case. First point that I would like to mention is these instruments you are mentioning, the special contribution, betterment contribution, which would be equivalent to revaluation in Colombia, similar to Colombia, as well as the traditional instruments that are not so used, but they are very well established in the municipal routines that allow to differentiate them. I think that this is a very important aspect. Then you also mentioned about the state grant with a subsidized credit program that encourage, or at least try to encourage, the use of that instrument. That is key point to look at the topic of the incentives of key stakeholders to implement or to promote the implementation instruments, and then it also presented the case of building capacity a sale as an estimate for value capturing. And with regards to this, you also mentioned a series of critical points that I think would also take us to an interesting debate about the political context, the objectives of implementation, and what you mentioned when you said that the land instruments do not replace planning, but actually they need planning. These points are very important. Precisely, is building capacity sale. Bring us to the next case from Brazil. This case is going to be presented by Camila Matroca. Camila is an architect and independent consultant with experience in urbanization and instruments for urban financing. She's a collaborator of the Lincoln Institute since 2010, and she's worked as an advisory consultant in the state and private areas of Brazil and the region. So thank you very much, Camila, for your presentation. Please go ahead. Thank you, Barbara. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to participate in this event. It seems that I have some connection issues, so please let me know if I need to turn my camera off to improve my signal. Yeah, we can hear you well. Perfect, thank you. Okay, right here, more than talking about the Brazilian case, specifically, I'm going to talk about the case of the city of Sao Paulo with the granting of the use of construction right. That instrument is seen at the national level. However, in spite of the 20 years of the national law, there are few cities that apply this. Few, it's 5,000 municipalities we're talking about. So it's because of what Christina was saying, that it's a few cities, not all cities, and for sure not all 5,000, more than 5,000 municipalities in Brazil have sufficient dynamics to implement an instrument of this type. But also, if we go to the capital cities of the state, there are a few of them that apply the instrument with the characteristics that this is applied in Sao Paulo. There is a coherence with regards to concept and standards. Right here, it is not about selling building capacity over the norm, but the idea is to use the instrument according to the existing norms. I'll try to make myself clear. The instrument that is defined at the national level establishes the concession of rights, so this is over other a basic index. That basic index does not have any urban or fiscal content. It is an agreement from the society that is established in the city, the plan of the city, and it defines what are the basic rights, which are the rights that integrate the right from property, and what the additional rights are. And these are the rights that are commissioned to the payment of taxes. So that's the general logic here. A lot, or well, the first discussions started in the 70s, is more than 40 years before getting to the point where we are today in the city of Sao Paulo, which is to have a basic coefficient. We have a unique unit here. This is for the whole city. It is equal to one for all the city. So what happened here? What can I mention about this timeline? In 1976, there were concept discussions about the land created. This is like the first record that there are some texts about this. And we have here the cover of the journal that published the results of those discussions in 77, I guess. But the concept that is drawn here is on this, so multiplying the land we have to provide the necessary support, like how to do this and so on. So this is what's foreseen, and this is what is going to finish with this instrument, the ODS instrument. And right here, then we begin with all those letters. These are all different instruments or attempts. EL is the law project. These are attempts for implementation. For the approval, for example, in 1991, we attempted for the first time to pass the basic coefficient in this legislation in the city of Sao Paulo, and it was not approved. But there are other things, for example, the interlink corporations that started a little bit before, more or less close to the equatorian, going a little bit over the standard. And then we had urban operations, which are projects in specific parameters. They were important precedents to begin selling this building capacity and for the city agents to accept this. And then finally, 2001, the statutes or bylaws for the city, national laws, and then the strategic directive plan that was approved in 2002. And that plan, for the first time, established the granting of these concessions in all the municipal territory. And what else? Well, here, there were other urban operations, and finally in 2014, the plan was changed, and the only concession was approved. So let's see what we have here. We have the map. So these are, this is city of Sao Paulo, and we say that that is,
Puede ser que tu presentación se quedó
and
parada.
maybe that your presentation got stuck also.
Camila, ahora sí.
Okay, now we have it.
Voy a sacar el
Sí,
video
ahora
por
vemos los
si.
mapas.
Sí, entonces aquí está
Yeah,
la cara
so
del perro.
this is where we are.
La nariz del perro y aquí las.
This is the nose of a dog, and then you can see the ears if you try hard. And on the upper maps, we have the coefficients that were approved back in 2002. So in here, to the left, we have the basic ones that were differentiated. So there were parts of the territory with the basic 1 and basic 2. And this had nothing to do with any urban intentions because that was approved this way by negotiating them with the agents. So it was more related to what the previous standard stated, like an adjustment or adaptation, than with an intention of transformation, because as I said, basic has no urban character. And the maximum can see to the right. I don't know if you see my pointer, but there was not much of an urbanistic intention. The negotiations were quite harsh back then, and they approved just the maximum, and it's not as easy as we'll see for 2014 to identify the intention of transformation for organizations in the urban sector. So it's important to say that the maximum coefficient always existed. Well, maybe not always, but they have existed for quite some time in our legislation. And this is based on the maximum, so it's not necessary to have the onerous grant in order to allow for the maximum, but sometimes they use this tool to justify what the law has provided for, but it's not clear that it means that for the whole system. In 2014, we had a basic equal 1 for the whole city. So this is what we see here on the map. And this map is communication material. This was a great effort back in 2014 in relation to communication for the society to try and translate technical aspects along with graphic elements so that it would be easier to understand. and to have more people being able to learn about the materials and try to understand. And this is, maybe this is not that clear, but these are the transportation access. And in here, we see that we have 4 maximums. And out of this transportation environment, the maximum limit is going to be 2, meaning that you can see the intention here. So it's precisely what we discussed with the people that are dedicated to this in Brazil, because onerous grant allows for more urban freedom when it comes to the building offer, when it comes to private interest or the private sector. These are the results of the onerous grant that started as irrelevant. Well, maybe not irrelevant, but if we take into account ethical and cultural aspects, the land value capture, well, I think we'd better use capture or recovery. So we started with little money, and then there was an increase of what we were able to gather after this introductory coefficient, or this single coefficient introduction. So since 2014, we see some things that were affecting, and then they were approved later on. But in here, we can see the actual numbers because our economy is not that good. So there was like this inertia for a while. And basically, this is a percentage of the property. And it varied for quite some time, but I think that was back in 2013 or 2014, where it reached 20% of the total investment in the city of São Paulo. So a fifth of all the investments were paid with resources coming from this grant. On the maps that we see here, you see where funds were gathered, and an important concentration on some areas. For those of you that are not familiar with Sao Paulo, these are the most expensive residential areas near the Pinheiros River on the southeastern sector. And to the right, we can see where all these contributions went. So the money was recovered and reinvested and distributed. Hopefully, I contributed to this debate, and I am available if you have any questions. Thank you. Thank you, Camila, for your presentation. I think that it was interrupted at some times, and so we did not understand everything because of some connectivity problems, but maybe we can retake some points during the debate. And when we prepared your presentation, when we were discussing your proposal, was not to talk much about value capture, because indeed the contributions for improvement in Brazil does not seem to be the most important element, but it's more on the onerous granting. So I think that this is an indicator of what Ignacio mentioned previously regarding the local conditions being different and the diversity of tools that are working better in some areas than others. You also mentioned communication, how important it was to communicate the contents of these strategies and tools, not only for the world of experts in real estate, but also for the community as a whole. And I think that that is key, something key that you mentioned. And we also have where money was gathered from and where it was invested, that redistribution of all these tools for land value capture, and that you were able to clearly demonstrate with your maps. So we will now go to the last case, which is the case of Chile. And we're going to have a presentation from Margarita Green, a master in sociology from the Catholic University in Chile, and a PhD from University College in London. And since 1991, she is a full-time professor in architecture for the University of Chile, and since 2010, she is also a member of the Catholic University Architecture faculty, and since 2013, she is a member of CEDEUS. She also participated on the OCD Compendium with Lincoln, and she will present the case of Chile.
¿Comparto pantalla?
Sí, por favor.
Ya, aquí estamos. Bueno, hola, buenas tardes, gracias.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here and be able to share the work that we have been doing. Well, this is my work that I organized based on the structure that they asked me to respect, because I felt that Chile has less in that field than other countries. It is a shorter experience. So regarding the Chilean case, I just cut short my presentation because I realized that I only had 10 minutes and not much as I thought before. So what is the experience in the application of land capture instruments as understood by this Lincoln Compendium? We have 4 scenarios, and I wanted to look for what we had. So basically, we found that, well, first, within this legal framework, we must clarify that it is based more on construction than on the urban aspect since 1949. And this is our framework, but we have been trying to move towards a national urban development policy that I would like to explain. And under these scenarios, what we have is an improvement fee. And this is what I found to be closer than other programs on pavement from the 1950s, and that evolved into the participative pavement programs from the 1990s. And I'm going to tell you that these are not exactly a land value capture, but it's more a recovery of the investment, where they ask all the patients that are nearby to take care of at least 30% of the cost of the investment. And in relation to land readjustment and the additional development fee, it is more interesting because in Chile, we did not have any of these things till recently. However, in 1997, there was an urban project department that started thinking how they can work with comprehensive plans. So since then, and for the municipalities, it was necessary to come up with a law for shared urban problems and plannings. And these urban plans, what they do is that they take some public land, for example, and then they invite the developers, and they are going to pay, or they can grant a concession of part of this land for development purposes, but at the same time, they would also require equipment and other things. And under this law for shared urban financing, they also developed some interesting strategies for additional development. And this is just related to metropolitan areas, as the planning program, we had first the SODUC and then the Control Urban Development Plans. And again, they are based on the shared urban financing. And what SODUC does is that they establish some areas where real estate developers can develop some areas that are not urban, but of course they are required social housing and also equipment. And these areas change to what we know as conditioned urban development plans, not only in Santiago, but also in Viña del Mar and Valparaíso, two important cities. So this is even more important because it's not just about the development of these areas of interest and conditioned urban development plans. And last, the most interesting strategy along this line that are those that have an impact fee. This is the more innovative and more interesting, I would say. This is the law for the contribution of public spaces that was recently passed. So it's a short experience, but it's already reflecting good results. And this law provides for the possibility of municipalities to receive contributions on public spaces, but in kind, in money. But since Chile has not had such a long planning tradition in order to adhere to this law, for example, if a developer would like to have a development in extension or intensity, but the municipality can charge in money, in kind, these contributions, but they have to be already as part of a plan for investment in mobility and public spaces structure. So these plans for public spaces have to be integrated into the regulating plan for the community and approved. So what's interesting is that somehow with it's like this monetary contribution on behalf of developers in order to densify or expand, the municipality is going to have these PMIPs approved by the municipality and integrated into their community zoning plan. So what we think is most interesting along this line is this law for shared financing, and I'm going to show you more details. So these areas for comprehensive development and also for the contribution of public spaces that would allow to capture land value before the development has even started. And I also wanted to emphasize that this way, within this legal framework that I have tried to present to you, we have to the left the laws or the general guidelines for construction. So we have come up with a national policy that is setting the basis for this type of instruments that is, I would say, more sophisticated. So this is similar to what I just mentioned, so I'm not going to go into detail on this. But what I wanted to say, as in here, we have the 4 scenarios that I just mentioned to you, and I wanted to emphasize that the first on the participated payment, I think that this is interesting because it has been applied in vulnerable sectors. So what they have done is to allow for the improvement of vulnerable sectors with pavement and also bicycle ways and sidewalks. And we have been working along with the central government, even though they might be small. So I was always saying that these shared urban financing law and the law for the contribution of public spaces that I consider to be important. This is another instrument for land readjustment that I mentioned. What's interesting is that these are projects for comprehensive urban planning, and this might be with public spaces where they can deliver some property or land to the developers, or for exploitation purposes. And in here we have two cases in which this has taken place. This is one in Antofagasta, La Chimba project. It was a landfill, and it became a development for the coastal area where they have social housing and very interesting things, and everything has been developed along with these same tools. And in this case, they handed this part of land in order for developers to invest and then be able to recover some of their investments. So they have now their property. And this is another case that was developed in Santiago. It's like middle class, and it is a place that was not used. So they try to encourage the developers to develop this subterranean place with the list of the commercial places, and it has been very successful. And it also included a food court. And then we have the cases of the SEDUC. And I think that I'm running out of time. So now I want to tell you about which have been the social, urban, and financial impacts. Well, when it comes to pavement, this is about the improvement of some vulnerable sectors and also land readjustment. It has been interesting for the development of unoccupied land. And however, there was no capacity on behalf of the municipalities of local governments to invest. So they were able to develop after working with them. And then as for additional rights, with SODUC that have allowed inside cities or in the outer areas to develop some areas by incorporating social housing. So I'm going to go now to my final part of the presentation. So what's important for us is to have been able to develop this national plan for urban development, something that we've never had before. And some of the purposes is to consider the social aspects and correct the imperfections. And this policy has a weakness, which is that it's not a regulation. It's just like for guidance purposes. So, and unless we don't have programs, it's going to be just something in writing. But the fact that it has already been written gives us some potential for municipalities for development purposes. And then these tools improve the management on behalf of the ministry, because for many times they were just coming up with housing, but with no planning whatsoever. And the same for zoning on both urban areas and inside cities that became these areas for conditioned urban development. And they have also had problems. Not everything has been great. For example, the PEDUC has been accused of developing things that are only middle class in the most poor areas that cannot be integrated to the society. So I'm not trying to sell what they have been lacking, but it's also important to know what we have been able to achieve through these instruments and tools, because Serbia and the Ministry of National Property are now authorized to acquire land. So now the ministry is creating a stock on public land. It's like a land bank, because we don't have a policy that would allow to guide this urban growth in an efficient manner, not for now, but something that is always up for discussion when we discuss these is when it comes to property tax. That is a way to recover or for land value capture purposes. But in our case, this is an instrument that I think that it has a lot of potential, but it's not commonly used because the values have not been updated, but it still has potential. And at last, I wanted to say that somehow we have this basis on the general law for urbanism and construction, and we also have a national policy that is going to guide the growth on urban areas. So we have a strong emphasis on comprehensive master plans, both when it comes to extension and densification. And this is the framework for institutionalized management of land value capture in terms that allowed for decentralization, because this year we had the first election of metropolitan governors. Chile is a very, very centralized. It is a long and narrow country, but it's centralized in Santiago. And last, we have this process currently being developed in Chile to establish the right to a dignified house and the right to cities. And as long as it is a right, it is not a law, but I think that we are in the right route in order for this to become. So I think that we have taken the right steps, and this is it for me. Thank you. Thank you, Margarita. A very interesting presentation in which you show the importance of the general legal framework required for these types of instruments to be implemented and to become first the rights and then laws. So very interesting, the context that you have currently. You also mentioned all these new instruments that you have that show the diversity of options that you currently have with this Constituent Assembly to participate in the land value capture or the value of the land, but you also integrated other tools that are aimed at the co-financing of costs, and they are not as oriented to the participation in the increase of land value, but more on refinancing these types of costs of infrastructure. You also mentioned something that is of interest for the audience related to national property and also the importance that this might have for subnational or local governments to have this that we have not mentioned, these land banks. And it is also interesting to see how these instruments are strongly linked to the planning instruments and tools. So again, thank you for your presentation. And now we have already presented the 4 cases. And I would like now to introduce Martin Smolka and Maria Mercedes Maldonado. They will start this panel with us in order to discuss the cases that were presented. Martin, I think that you all know him. Those of us who are interested in the soil management. So I'm going to introduce the both of them, and then I'll give the floor to Maria Mercedes to begin. But Martin is the main researcher and director of the program on Latin America and the Caribbean of the Lincoln Institute, and an economist specialized in markets and soil policy, land access, and property tax. And Maria Mercedes Maldonado, she is a lawyer and researcher specialized in urban rights and zone management, soil policies, the right to housing and cities, informality and soil and housing access, a secretary of planning and for habitat, and also in this city. So we would like to start. Welcome both to the panel. And I would like to start the panel with Maria Mercedes. As we said in the beginning, this event is part of a cycle of events related to 100 years of contributions to land value capture in Colombia. And I would like to ask you, Maria Mercedes, we've heard for cases and the diversity of tools according to the local conditions. And I would like to ask you if you could put into context these specific experiences in Colombia. Thank you, Barbara, and good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you. And I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation. As for Colombia, those of you who have followed this cycle, I guess you have information about Colombia. But in the framework of these presentations, I was a part of this compendium on behalf of Colombia. I was a part of this study. So Colombia participates, I would say, of the tools that have been presented. Colombia, just like Brazil, has a network of cities that are relatively different when compared to the countries where we have differences in Latin America. And all the way since the beginning, we had in Colombia this concern in relation to urban planning and financing. And I said, since the beginning of the 20th century, and also for municipalization and strengthening processes for the utilities companies. So I think that this mixture, I would say, of these factors accounts for the early reglementation of all of these processes for municipalities, and also the thorough use. So there were not so many aspects in relation to local governments, because the local governments have had to look for all of these with different results, but they have to get their own resources. And this is the reason why we celebrate 1 century of this contribution to land value capture, with this use not of something in writing like the case of many countries in Latin America, but it has been widely used, and they have already financed some of the road infrastructure for the municipalities in Colombia. And I think it's important to take this into consideration, because in Latin America, we have so many regulations, but sometimes you take a look at them and they are not applied.
In 1989, we had a reform law. Christine was saying that they took too long to approve a law in Ecuador, to say 5 years, which took 4 decades, and that it was quickly substituted by the law that is currently in force. Both are in force. The law from 88 to 97, and the one from 89, that incorporate instruments such as the readjustment of land or properties, and instruments to guarantee the access to land for lower income people, mandatory percentages of social interest housing in these readjustments of the properties, or directly any project is incorporated to urban development. But mine goes back to this more direct idea for the recovery or capture, because of the increase in land price produced by urban development, not necessarily because of the public work. So it follows that idea of the tax instrument, of adopting a tax that is called, well, at that moment it was called the contribution formulation development in this law, the participation in land value. And it responds a little bit to what has been discussed here, that part of the increase in that value has been recovered by the collective groups. The idea is to continue into tax strengthening, and at the same time that all the project of centralization in Colombia, the centralization policy of the 80s, is linked to the strengthening of property cadastre and so on. But this does not work completely well, in spite of the very important conception and very consistent conception. And we started to really do the journey, or our law is as part of the Spanish law, for equitable distribution of burden and benefits, and that has the urban obligations into it. And we are into that path of strengthening these urbanistic obligations. So what we have said is important, and it's also important to see the study. First of all, the experiences are very diverse, as I said here. In Colombia, we have had the great weakness and the absence, and not so much of a policy. I do believe a lot in decentralization and in the municipal autonomy, but I would say that there is a lack of a national program that supports these instruments, a national program to share experiences, to strengthen others to support with regulations. Sometimes even some regulations go against some of the decisions of the municipal progress. So I think that this is all very important. And then it is important, or it is difficult to make a global evaluation. I really like the data that I saw here because, as I told you, these are sometimes continuous experiences, such as these not value continuation with ups and downs, and it depends on the political communities also. And I wouldn't necessarily say that the governments and the left do more or less, but I would say that the different municipalities, you cannot talk about a national panorama, a national landscape. There are different cities, different experiences. But I do think that in order to highlight what Colombia has been doing for about 10 years, more or less, just to put this urbanistic obligations is the learning that we got from Brazil. So there's a lesson that we got from Brazil, and this is the idea of incorporating the basic indexes to require either building capacity sale, as Ecuador is doing, or urbanization obligations, like the additional indexes are subject to the compliance with the urbanistic obligations. What is interesting about this? Because here we talk not only about funding, but also about land management. I think that in this sense, Colombia has been demonstrated that it is strong no matter how many resources, how many monetary resources we have acquired through these instruments. But one of the of the problems of this contribution for land value is to go and get the land, or get the resources, but the instruments are more diverse in terms of obtaining the land. I mean, not obtaining or acquiring the land, but making the rules of urban development to require the construction of social interest housing as priority and obtain land for collective uses, not just the local sessions, but also the sessions for structuring systems that sometimes it's more powerful to see how much land was obtained, how much was saved, how much was not acquired through the public acquisition, more than just the instrument through which the money comes in, the readjustment of land. That improves a lot of the urban design and the incorporation of new land to the city, and the concerns on the social mixture and social groups and so on, that sometimes you can measure that. So the anticipation to informality, these are things, I mean, it's something greater than just what talks about the resources that come in. And Colombia, with all its problems, well, there are a few cities, and we also have to say, as we're saying it, Colombia is moving forward in that direction of a given importance of having this land for social and objectives and yeah, social objectives. That's it. We still have the task because of what Laura mentioned, given so much emphasis to climatic action. I think that in Latin America, we still have to relate the land policies with the climate action. In Bogota, we're just starting to have a brief discussion in terms of territorial organization. So we are having this discussion in the council at this moment of using land value through right transfer to acquire environmental land around the city. But I would finish with this idea that the difficulty of national meeting. I don't know how to also focus on an idea of the potential that the experiences of the cities offer for the context of each country and for the Latin American context as a whole, and the importance of looking the obtention of financial resources as a whole, the obtention of land and the accomplishment of the social objectives, such as fighting against social segregation, anticipation of informality, and this is on the agenda, which is to incorporate the environmental objectives too. Thank you very much.
Mil gracias, María Mercedes.
Thank you very much, Maria Mercedes. I think that it was
Contextualización
a
muy
very broad
completa,
contextualization, very complete also.
que creo que también
And I think
reconoce
that it also recognizes
de los instrumentos,
the diversity
diversidad
of
de las
the
realidades,
instruments,
pero
the
también
diversity of the realities,
lo que tienen en
but
común,
also
creo que todas las
what they have in
presentaciones
common, because
giraban,
something that
todos los
all
casos
the presentations,
presentados
cases
giraban
presented
exactamente alrededor de los tres
revolve
puntos que tú
precisely
mencionaste.
around the three
Primero, el
items that
ingreso,
you have mentioned, which is general
permiso de
income,
acceso a suelo
to allow
para objetivos
access to land
colectivos
for collective
y el
objectives, common
tercero,
objectives, and the third
la
one
de la segregación
had to
social y
do
de la
with the
inclusión
social
para poder
segregation or social
y yo
inclusion to
creo
see it
que
better.
aquí hay algo
So I think that there is
todos
something here that we
considero que
share
también
in these
muestra
cases, and I
la
think that
diversidad de
that
opciones que
also
hay
shows
que
the great
hacer ese
diversity of
objetivo y
options we have to reach
planteamos
that
las
objective,
potencialidades y
and
también
also, well, the potentials, but also the
que
obstacles
hay que sobrellevar.
that we have to overcome.
Tenemos varias preguntas
We
interesantes
have several interesting questions in the chat. Thank you very much to our audience for that.
Pero antes de retomar
But
algunas de esas
before
preguntas,
going to some
quisiera
of
darle
those
la palabra a
questions, I'd like to
Martín.
give the floor to Martin.
Martín, estamos desde hace mucho
Martin,
tiempo en la discusión, en el debate
for a
sobre
long
los
time, we've been in the
instrumentos
discussion and the
de
debate
gestión
about
de
the land
recuperación
management
de la
instruments,
plusvalía
the
o
land
de
value
la repartición,
recovery,
justamente
or
de
the
la
fair
plusvalía
distribution of
y
land
hemos
value.
visto en las
And we
presentaciones
have seen
lo que nos
in
han
the
marcado las compañeras, los
presentations what
compañeros.
the colleagues
Por
have
un
shown to
lado,
us is on
el
the one
tema
hand,
de cómo generar
the
políticas
topic on how to
públicas.
generate
O sea,
public
tenemos el
policies.
caso de
We
casos
have
singulares,
cases
pero
of very singular and particular
logros que
experiences, but
se
also the
pueden
great accomplishments
alcanzar cuando se
that can
transforma en
be
política
reached
pública.
when you transform
Esa
these
sería
things into public policy.
una pregunta
I think
central
that
para
would
ti,
be
cómo
a
lograr
central
eso.
question for you, how
Y
to
el tema
accomplish
de
that.
los incentivos
And
y los
the
obstáculos
topic
para poder
that has to do with
implementar
the incentives and the
estas
obstacles to
políticas.
be able to
Eso
implement these
creo que ha
instruments.
sido también
I
como
think that that has
un
been
eje
also like
articulador entre
an
todas las
articulating
presentaciones.
access with all the different
¿Qué nos
presentations.
podrías decir,
So what
habiendo
can you
escuchado
tell
estos
us,
cuatro
having heard
casos y a María
these
Mercedes
four cases and having heard
de
also Maria
Colombia?
Mercedes with a Colombian context?
Tendrías que prender tu
Martin, you have to turn
micrófono.
on the
No te
microphone.
escuchamos.
Gracias por la invitación.
Thank you
Y
very much for
qué
the
pregunta
invitation. And
Bárbara.
you're giving me difficult questions, Barbara. They're not
Déjeme
easy.
empezar
But let me begin
con algunos comentarios que me
with
parece
some comments
que pueden de alguna
that
manera
I think
responder a tu
that in
pregunta.
a
Lo
way
primero
they
que
could
es
answer your
las
question.
cuatro
First of
presentaciones
all,
de los
is that,
países
well, the four
son
presentations from the
presentaciones
countries
felices
are very,
en exponer un
very
campo
positive in terms of
de
presenting
investigación
a very
y
broad
de
field of
alguna
research.
el
And that
proyecto
in a
de
way,
OECD pienso yo que tiene
the
un mérito
OECD
inmenso
project
en
has a
exponer
great
esas
merit in terms of presenting that variability
y
of situation
circunstancias
and
que son
circumstances
aplicados y
in
qué
which they're
mecanismos
applied and under
utilizan
what
esos instrumentos.
circumstances
Y
social
los
systems
cuatro casos
apply.
a presentar
And the
desde
four
su
cases that were presented are also
quisiera
very
empezar
specific. But I would like to
como
begin
estamos ahí es
by
un
saying, I
evento
mean,
que de
this
alguna
is an
manera
event that in a way
instrumento
celebrates
aparentemente un instrumento
apparently
que foi relativamente
an
pouco
instrument
discutido
that was
e a sua
relatively
contribuição de
that had relatively little discussion, and
desenvolvimento
it's a
em termos
contribution of improvement to land
eu
value
quisiera
capture,
primeiro
as you said in Colombia. So first of all, I would like to make a point because at the end of the day, everything is land value capture, land value
por que
contribution.
isso? Porque
And
digamos
why
que o
is that?
princípio básico que há
Because
por
the
detrás
basic principle behind all
a
this is
intervenção
that
pública
there is a public
ou essa
intervention, a
intervenção
public
pública
participation. If
por
there
água
isn't
de
public
incentivo ou por investimentos
participation
se pode
through
discutir
investment or any other
um
thing, you can
porque
discuss between
genera
one or the other,
benefício
but
de
it
alguma
generates a
maneira tem que
benefit that in
reverter
one or another way will have to
na
derive
facilitação ou
into
na
the
viabilidade da
facilitation or the
intervenção.
viabilization of the
E
intervention
dos
itself.
casos, dois
And the
países,
cases
penso que o caso
where
apresentado
this is
pela
applied, I think that the
diretora
case that has been
mostrando a diferença
presented
entre Polônia
showing the difference between
Reino Unido é
Poland and the United
interessante nesse
Kingdom is
sentido,
interesting in
porque
that sense
demonstra
because it clearly demonstrates something that talks about this selection of the right to build, or the obligations of developing and so on. So they wouldn't exist if there were no public investments that would support that greater building capacity that is derived from those instruments. In other words, it is like the case for the collection of the building rights that we have in Sao Paulo. But in order to do this to be applied in the area, there is a precondition that somebody has to invest in infrastructure that would support a greater density. And at the end of the day, it is the same principle that is behind the continuation or the betterment continuity. It's as if I was charging the betterment continuity afterwards, because somebody in a given moment invested and benefited to be able to offer this greater density, but these beneficiaries did not pay for the contribution for that public investment. So it is like the first point that I wanted to make, because in a way, it is something general, almost through all the different instruments. Even in the case of Chile, in a way, they have that same idea present, that there are investments that affect this participatory work. I mean, the same case, the case of Ecuador also in Cuenca is the same thing. The origin of the discussion in Ecuador is the same case as that with program of say that. I mean, it follows the same principles. What we are discussing is really a series of modalities on how to implement those things, how those things were accomplished, how is it was possible to institutionalize the different ways of doing things, of making that basic principle concrete. I don't know if I'm making myself clear with my participation. And then we have here the case of the OECD, and it is here illustrated by those countries. But I would say that there is a very important thing for that public debate, and is that apparently the countries, the cities, the jurisdictions are similar. Some are able to do one thing, they're able to collect, and others don't. So the problem is not probably the size of the municipality, it's not probably the income or anything like that. There's got to be something else to explain why it is applicable in some countries and not in other countries or in other places. Jurisdictions that are comparable. So that suggests that there is a potential of expansion of those instruments that we have to analyze. And I think that that is part of the great benefit that the research and the documentation should provide, like those cases that we're doing. So this is very important, especially for the public debate. It's like saying, okay, you're exactly like that one. They accomplished that. Why don't you accomplish it? Why is it not possible? Is it not possible to do it in your jurisdiction, but it's possible to do it in other municipalities? So I think that those are some very important lessons. What also some of the cases suggest is that the land value cover capture does not need to be so explicit in terms of what it is. People sometimes are doing things without knowing. And in the United States, for example, we have an instrument that is very strong, very important, but it has never been treated as land value recapture, and it is the inclusive housing, mandatory housing, and that is literally something that would otherwise go to the pocket of the landowner. And now it is not going there because a developer has the obligation of putting more social housing. And because they have that apparent additional cost, it's going to take that for part of the land price. So, or it's an economy one. So the circuit is the same and it is present in those institutions too. And there are lots of, I mean, the Chilean case also shows that they are doing things, and in spite of the fact that in Chile there is a strong ideological resistance, but in practice they're already doing a lot of these things. Even, I mean, they're recognizing, and this is something that we have also learned throughout this discussion, that it is important to recognize, but also to admit that you are recovering the land value. Sometimes it is done out of consensus, but sometimes it is done without really knowing what is most ubiquitous instrument for the recovery of land value that we have. I would say in Latin America and in most of the other countries of the world. So when you talk about indexations, what are indexations? You're developing something, you're going to be benefited from something that is public. So give a return to the public because of the benefit, because of this gratuity that you are receiving from the collective effort. So it's the same basic principle that is to be put into this contribution for that value. And that is present over there in the numbers and the jurisdiction like this without thinking about land value capture. They don't think about that title, but then you start saying, okay, you don't have that ideological resistance anymore. And that's like one of the questions. So just to answer those concerns, and then so you have an ideological issue with this, but you're actually doing that de facto. So it's a way of overcoming a pressure. You have that ideological pressure, but it's not so perceived as such. Another quick point that I would like to mention also is that the city document suggests, and in a way it is also exposed to the cases of the four countries, and is that when we discuss the topic of the implementation of land boundary recovery policies, there could be at least 4 or 5 phases of the project. First, the idea that you realize this is something that has to be done. In a lot of places, people didn't even realize explicitly that it has to be done. Secondly, it's important to design an adequate instrument considering the institutional framework and designing the instrument. Thirdly, institutionalize it. Fourth, implementing it. And then you have to do well, the implementation is quite advanced in a lot of places. In other places, they're in previous stages. But anyway, you have to overcome a lot of resistance that is coming from all the different parties. And there is a very interesting comparison here between the case of Sao Paulo, for example, and the Mexican case. In the Mexican case, the resistance is coming from within the public administration. And the case then that Ignacio demonstrated that it is about citizenship too, in spite of the fact that there is a discussion about the introduction of the instruments when they were being set up or when they were writing the constitution of the state in the state of Mexico, Mexico City, where they proposed that or said this, and it was criticized a lot by the press. And there were many other types of resistance, and that really affected the whole origin. Possibility of doing this in Mexico, this resistance is more volunteer. In the case of Sao Paulo or Brazil in general, all that process is a long process for social mobilization for this urban reform to create the basis for discussion, very different, but also like in the case of Colombia, that in a way, this is not more from top to bottom, but with some strong elements in common. And I think that this is something that also answers the other question over, because this is actually coming from those locations that have a need. As I was saying, as Omar saying, there is nothing like need to be able to move the world. So people will do things out of need. So that's a very strong and very important engine to act. Brazil is actually one of the countries where the municipalities have, it's a country that has a very important decentralization. But Colombia, when the same instrument was introduced, this contribution for the land bomb, you also had a very strong or very serious problem that they had to overcome because at the national level they were not getting or giving them the funds that they needed. So that in a way acquired the need of creating that instrument. Mexico has a tradition of being completely supported by this federation, by the national state, so that in a way explains that, I imagine, a little bit this difficulty that Mexico has had because of its municipalities and the decentralized units. So I already talked a lot probably, and perhaps I just wanted to mention very quickly that there is still a world to be better explained, better applied, but by the way, that work the OECD is doing is going to have a very important impact, not so much or not only because of the content of the work, but also the impact of coming from such important institutions like OECD and so on, and that doesn't have such a strong presence as OECD in the international setting. And obviously, that's a game changer in a way in the uh, in the head or in the induction of these behaviors. And I leave you finally with a challenge to Rudiger and to Maria Mercedes, and also you, Barbara. You raised this topic of the use of these land value recovery instruments in climate change to implement that. One thing is when you create a series of new burdens for developers, you tell them, okay, if you do this for climate change, that will relieve your burden a little bit. So that's a way of doing it. But I think that we have to go way ahead of that and we have to see up to which extent. For example, the values that the collectivity will have to pay for the behavior of the private individuals with regards to the risk of climate change will have to be offset from the very beginning. In other words, I think that this is a more organic circle in terms of this land value applied to climate change. In other words, what is the burden that the collective has to pay for a private problem? So, like how you privately behaved with regards to the risk and the potential risk that exists. It is just an indication, but I think that we have to work in a more advanced way. And it's not just like a Robin Hood policy for the application of those instruments. It's not like we're going to take from here to then generate some additional income that can be applied in another place. I think that we have to go beyond just that. But it was just that on my part. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Martin. With this, I think that we have answered two questions that we had selected from the chat. One was directed to the topic of ideological limitations that I think Ignacio had mentioned at the very beginning in the presentation about Mexico. And I think that this is a topic that can be discussed for a long time and that also touches the aspect of communication that Camila mentioned. And then you also talked at the end about how to apply the land management instruments not only to these topics for gentrification, neighborhood improvement, social interest housing, and the expansion of the electric systems in the city, but also to climate change. That was a question from Bananas from India, who is also present in this event. And we're very happy to have her here with us. I think that, well, I see a little bit of time. I think our event only has a couple more minutes to go. So maybe last one, there are two more questions that we have selected from the chat that are a little bit more technical. And I think we're not going to have enough time to answer. They were more related to how to determine land value valuation of the food, taking into account that the cadastral values and the commercial value do not coincide. That was the technical question. And then the other one was related to how to distribute the burdens and benefits in the properties with this principle of equitable distribution. That was another question that's a little bit more technical. But I think that in order to conclude, to wrap here, I would like to ask a question to Camila. Because I think that in her example, she showed that transfer in 2014, where you took that step moving towards a contextualization of the existing instruments with this baseline for the whole city, with the zones are identified for protection and for redistribution. And normally what we hear a lot in the debate about land management, that they say that there is still investment. And what you've shown in your slides was completely the opposite, that the step first, you went through a very strong negotiation process. You had the support of the community that was also very strong, and at the same time, it triggered very interesting investment, if I'm not wrong. So maybe we can close with that topic, that I think it is really moving us in terms of land management. Sure, thank you very much, Laura. Well, I wouldn't say that it triggered investment. I think that this is a risky statement. However, we could say that there is evidence that the investment was not.
And this is where there's been an increase. So I think that is something relevant that we can take from the Sao Paulo experience, and this is why the experience is so relevant, because you can say that Sao Paulo is a unique case like no other in any other city, but maybe in Mexico City, because it is such a big city with a real estate economy that it's so dynamic. And in here, we can see that, but I wouldn't say that Sao Paulo has barriers to expansion to other municipalities. So some of the things that were said, and if we go back to the newspapers of the 90s and early 2000s, they were always saying that if they were to take those burdens, then they'll go to other municipalities and they would go out of Sao Paulo, but that didn't happen. They are still here and they are still producing at a high rate. And important evidence is that even, or in spite of the pandemic, the values kept on increasing. So this means, and correct me, Martin, if I'm wrong, this is more related to macro and economical factors, because currently we have, for example, the low interest rates, and that is going to channel more resources to the real estate sector. So if there is money in the sector, then the sector keeps on producing and paying for all these burdens. And they produce in Sao Paulo and also in Rio and Brasilia and other cities in the country that have a very active real estate sector, and they keep on producing. So in Sao Paulo, there has been recovery. I think that you're having some connectivity problems again, but anyway, thank you so much for your answer. And we have come to the end of this event because in my case, I think it's 11 p.m. and I think that we have different time zones between Boston and the United States and different countries in Latin America and even India. So I would like to thank you all for your presentations and for the debate. So we are going to gather all of the questions and we will send them to all the speakers to see how we can distribute the answers as well. I am really happy with the event and hopefully we have contributed to the countries and regions debate. So hopefully within the framework of the programs of the German Agency for International Cooperation, in many cases related to zoning and urban development and management of natural resources, and also expansion of urban infrastructure in the corresponding countries, to continue with this debate and keep up doing our things to be able to promote all these processes in the region. Again, thank you. I think that there was a question at the beginning regarding the publication of this OECD compendium. And I think that this has been planned for early 2022 or around April, I don't know. And I think that for the first half of the upcoming year, it's going to be published so that anyone can access it. So without anything else to say, I would like to thank all the presenters and all the participants. We had approximately 111 participants. We still have almost 100 still with us, which is a good indicator of the interest on the presentations and their quality. So again, thank you very much. Good night or good afternoon.
No, okay. Bueno, gracias.
Gracias, Bárbara.
Thank you again.
Chao, gracias a todos. Qué gusto compartir con ustedes.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure to share with you.